So now we've reached step 7 in the Vito design pattern catalog entry. This is item number 7, and in this catalog entry that we're trying to create for the Vito design pattern, the sample design pattern that we want to create a catalog entry for, this step is the consequences step. Step number 7, consequences. This step is intended to list the consequences of using your design pattern. And the consequences can be good, consequences can be bad, and you're supposed to list them all. So both the good and bad design pattern consequences. Here is, as you've seen, a schematic showing how to work with the Vito design pattern. You have client code, checks that wants to perform some action, and wants to check for a Vito on that action, sends a message through various link objects, a Vito chain, possible Vito chain, and then processes the results, looks to determine whether or not any of these links have in fact vetoed the request. So what possible consequences could you have here? Well, let's think about it. The first consequence is obviously going to be that the pattern works as it should. So the consequences of this pattern is it allows you to encapsulate the voting objects so that any object may make its decisions independently of the code in other objects. In other words, you want to extrapolate the decision-making process. You want to extract it from the rest of the client code and put it in a well-defined Vito chain. That's the consequence of this pattern, and any object may veto a request. You are also assured that each link in the object chain gets a chance to veto a request before sending it on to the next object. So that's the good consequences. Consequences of this pattern is it allows you to encapsulate the voting objects so that any object may make its decisions independently of the code in other objects, and any object may veto a request. So that is a statement really of the idea behind the pattern. That's the good consequences. You are also assured that each link in the object chain gets a chance to veto a request before sending it on to the next object. So that is the good consequences. And on the other hand, encapsulating all the decision-making components into discrete objects can be a problem because doing so can deny one object needed information from the rest of the objects. So as you know, this design pattern extracts code into these links, but these links, however, may be dependent on one another. In other words, in order to make a decision in link number 2, you actually have to have access to data from link number 1, for example. So the consequences are that you may encapsulating all these decision-making components into one discrete objects can be a problem, because doing so can deny one object needed information from the rest of the objects. If that's the case in your implementation, consider combining 2 or more link objects into one as needed so encapsulation won't be violated. So in this example, if link 2 needs information that link 1 can supply, you might consider that the encapsulation demands that link 1 and link 2 in fact be the same object. Different parts of the same object have information needed for another part of the same object, and so you might say link 1 and link 2 should be the same object. So encapsulating all the decision-making components into discrete objects can be a problem, as doing so can deny one object needed information from the rest of the object. So that's a possible consequence. And here's the solution. If that's the case in your implementation, consider combining 2 or more link objects into one as needed so the encapsulation won't be violated. Another potential problem comes when one object in the chain of objects doesn't pass on a veto correctly. Now this is technically speaking a consequence, but it's a minor one because it's really saying that if the design pattern has not been implemented correctly, then there will be a problem. So it's not a fundamental problem with the design pattern. It could be a potential problem with implementations. Because the objects are in a chain, you're dependent on the correct functioning of each link in the chain to get the proper results. So if one object in the chain of objects doesn't pass on a veto correctly, then the veto won't be passed on to the veto that occurred won't be passed on to the client code. Client code won't know about it, and so in fact you have a problem there. But as I said, that's not a fundamental problem with the design pattern per se. That's an implementation problem. So those are 2 possible bad consequences of working with the Vito design pattern. You can have a problem because if you encapsulate all the decision-making components into discrete objects, that can be a problem because it can deny one object needed information from the rest of the objects. And you can have when one object in the chain of objects doesn't pass on a veto correctly. Okay, so in the consequences step 7, you should make an effort to describe accurately the consequences of using your design pattern and including all possible problems, even if the design pattern is not implemented correctly. So that is step number 7, the consequences step.